So I really wanted to share my template with you. This is tried and tested, and I always start my tracks with this template. It has evolved over time, and it's not perfect. I will probably update it soon and drop some new samples in and make some tweaks, but I would encourage you to have a look at this, have a play, make your own tweaks based on what you like, and yeah, just have fun with it really. Any suggestions, please get in touch, let me know. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this and how you might do something differently, but it seems to work for me. And yeah, it's from tips and tricks I picked up from various people over the years, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve. So I've got a very simple idea just loaded in, just to help illustrate some of the decisions I've made with this template. And of course, it might help if you play along with the file, which you have access to. So if I start with the kick and bass, right, the kick and the bass are in the same group together. Okay, this is separate to the actual drums. There's one kick channel. This will then become two kick channels when I eventually decide on what kick I'm using. I'll then duplicate it, and then I'll sidechain everything to that channel. That'll be more obvious. If that doesn't make sense, it'll be more obvious when I walk through a project. But for now, I don't have a sidechain kick channel because I don't know what the kick is yet until I've sort of finished the track. Then the bass group has a number of different bass channels. These will then feed into this group here, and then that feeds into the kick and bass group. So if I walk through each channel, so for the kick, the hats, snare, and the percussion, I use drum racks. I think these are awesome because you can load a bunch of samples in, and it allows you to choose and just play around. And for me, I like to get ideas down really quickly, and so if I've got them already loaded here, it's super quick to just change things up and get a new idea in. If I have to go searching in the browser for each sound, for me it takes too long. The one problem with this is you get kind of too reliant on these samples, so it's really important to refresh the samples every now and then. But yeah, I would encourage you to get a handful of sounds that you like, stick them in a drum rack, and that's part of your template. In terms of the actual processing that I have within the template ready to go, there's this processing here I do on most of my kicks, which is just adding some drive on the filter, and then I'll tweak the decay as well. That's pretty standard, but that's not already built in. I do that on each track, but then the kicks then split with this audio effect rack here with two chains. So one is just the dry signal at -4 dB, and then there is a parallel compression chain which is doing heavy compression. And this is a trick I learned from Max Chapman on one of his videos, where with this EQ here you're isolating the lower end and you're really bringing energy to the kick with this part of the chain. So without it, punchy but not really any low weight, and then you can hear that makes a big difference there. You can also obviously tweak the dB here, the levels, just to taste, depending on the kick you've got and the kind of track you're making. As a note, I would always make sure oversampling selected on your EQs just to get the highest quality sound. And then other than that, there's not really too much. There's a drum bus, which I use sometimes, but I find the drum bus a little bit unreliable when you use it on kicks, I find, because I feel like it takes some of the low end and the sub away, and unless you're making techno or tracks where you need a really long tail, I don't feel like this boom setting really works for house. So with it on, sounds great, but I don't know how you'd use that in a house track that has a bass line. Well, for me anyway, I use sometimes quite complex bass lines that are really sort of jumping around in amongst the kicks, so I don't really have a use for this section. And without that, if I turn up you can really hear like actually that takes a lot of the sub out, and I think there's some sort of high pass filter built into this effect as well as compression. So yeah, that's there just as a maybe. And then the EQ, which is a high pass at 30 hertz, and a compressor. Again, I don't really use the compressor too much on a kick, mainly because I don't think it needs it a lot of the time. But I try play around with it and usually end up thinking it sounds better without. So look, if you have an idea of how to use a compressor consistently on a kick and it makes it sound better, then let me know. But I don't feel there's too much of a need to do that. The individual bass channels, I don't usually have operator. I'll just have it blank and I can put whatever I want in there. Then I'll have a utility to control the volume coming out of the VST of the instrument, a compressor, which is in my opinion important on bass lines because you want all your notes to be at the same volume, and without this compressor they can vary. So yeah, you want quite a lot of compression there just to make sure the levels are all consistent, as if you're using a sample, like an audio sample. It'd be the same volume on each note, and that's what you want here. Sidechain compression comes later in the bass group. Then there's an EQ here, which is a simple high pass, and then a utility which you can use to modulate volume, I've got some bass mono as well, and this is consistent across the other bass channels I've got here. In the bass group I've got multi-band compression, and this is to sidechain the frequencies below about 200 hertz to the kick, which I'm doing here. And if I solo that so you can hear, and if I solo the mids, so you see that is not being sidechained, and that helps it cut through the mix. And especially if you've got overlapping bass notes over the kick drum, then those higher frequencies can then remain playing. And it might not always be optimal, but for me it's quite nice having that. And if you have a really aggressive bass line that you do want to sidechain, you want the kick to come through more, then you'd sidechain across the whole frequency. You could just increase that like this. And then other than that, there's an EQ on the bass group. So the kick and bass group doesn't have too much. Again, there's another EQ. Then I've loaded in some saturation compressor, which I don't always use. To be honest, I don't really use that much. I don't often feel like the saturation is needed. It can help glue the sounds a bit, but maybe it adds something there. I found sometimes it can take away the subs as well if you're not careful. So I'm always using it sparingly if I'm using it at all. And then same with the compressor. I don't think, in the type of music I like to make, I don't need to use a compressor on the kick and bass channel group, because I think it just messes up the transients and the dynamics of the bass line. Maybe in tech house it works pretty well, where you need the sort of consistent bass coming through. But I'm also paranoid as well about the kick level changing. Like, you want that kick to be consistent volume throughout. If it's lowering a couple of dB when the bass line plays on every bar, that once you hear that, you can't unhear that. That'd drive me mad. So yeah, there's probably ways to avoid that, to be fair. But for now I'll generally steer clear of compression on this group. For the drums, So similar story, I got a load of samples in a drum rack. Yeah, which helps the creativity, helps getting ideas down quickly. And same with the snare and the percussion. Not too much processing on these channels. There's some EQ, a reverb, and a compressor typically on each of these. There's a bit more going on the group though. So I've got a main, I've called it main here as a dry signal. Then a trick I learned from Rossi is to have some reverb on the sides. When I say sides, I mean essentially either side of your stereo field, the opposite of mono. And the way I've done this here, the way Rossi's explained it, is you have the reverb here at full wet, and then a filter delay which is fully pushed out to the left and the right with no center signal coming through, and then an EQ as well, just to avoid any lower muddiness coming through. And this adds some nice ambience to the drums and a nice natural organic feel. To be used sparingly, of course. And then lastly, there's parallel compression. With an EQ. The EQ is just doing a high pass. So clearly, you don't want this channel too loud. But it adds some nice punch to the groove, I find. I've also got some channels in here for some plugins I used quite a lot. Stylus RMX for sort of breaks and drum loops. The M1 as well is a recent addition, which is really good for drums and samples. And then audio for top loops. I've got crashes and open hats. I keep these out of the drum group because any compression or processing you do, generally probably helpful to have the crashes and the open hat separate, just so they're not being pulled down or to put it another way, you want them out and wide and open and not to be muddied or pulled down with the rest of the compression on the drum group. So in my opinion, it's better to keep them separate. On the pads, where I have all my chords, stabs, keyboards, instruments, I've got 4 channels loaded in, so 3 synths and a loop cloud. The loop cloud is it's called that really just as a reminder that it's pretty cool going through loop cloud, and I find it's helpful for the last sort of 10% of the track to get some vocals or some effects or something. It's good for inspiration. I wouldn't usually use loop cloud just to as the main idea for the track, but it's really good for the filling in the gaps. And then each of these synths I'd load in something like a Diva, Omnisphere, or Wavetable or something like that. And then the processing I do is pretty similar for each one. It's a utility to reduce volume because usually these VSTs are really loud. Then delay, reverb, again like standard sort of settings on there. Chorus, phaser, EQ, and compressor. I generally think EQ and then compressor in that order works well, because then you're compressing a sound that's already been, you're basically then not compressing any unwanted frequencies in your sound. So each of these are fairly similar, and then on the group there's saturation, EQ, and compressor. again, I'd be using compression very sparingly on a group like this, because naturally you'd want the instruments to be different volumes, but subtle use can help glue the sounds together for sure. Within the pads group, there's a sample placeholders here. So if I wanted to drag something from Loop Cloud like this one, you can quickly do that. And then you can process them together in this group here. I've got a few placeholders here for resampling, so if I recording elements of my track and then resampling them, like putting something through a tantra, for example, I would put them here. Vocals, which is no processing, but it would typically involve reverb, delay, EQ, compression. And then finally, texture, so your final noise, background noise, which I'd have EQ, delay and reverb. This is very low in the mix, so it's barely audible. But it does make a difference. That does add some nice gluing effect to your sounds. I'm not really a big user of sends and returns. Maybe one day. I feel like I like to have control of each channel and the reverb and delay on each channel. So I've not really got into using these sends, to be honest. I also don't know how it would work if you were to bounce all of your channels to stems, to audio. How that would work with the sends. Like would the delay and the reverb coming from here then appear on your stems for each of these channels? I don't know if it does work like that. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I still haven't really jumped on the bandwagon of using these sends yet. Maybe when I start doubling the amount of channels on a project, then I'll need to just save my computer. But for now, not using those. On my main channel, there's not much, to be honest, going on. Like an EQ with some mid side, which, to be honest, I don't really use it that much. I might, if I'm mastering myself, then I would use that. Reference VST, which is not really essential, but it's quite a cool, quick way to compare your song to other people's songs. So you can load a bunch of tracks in here, and then it will compare your song with the other songs, and it will tell you what frequency range is lacking or is too much, and it just allows you to make good informed mixing decisions relative to the songs that you are trying to not replicate, but the sort of genre you're trying to make. And then other than that, I've got a couple of filters, low pass and high pass, which I activate using my keyboard. So trick I learnt from Dive In Live, where I've got letter Q activates the high pass. And then a low pass, which letter P activates. And then the letter I activates mono, which is helpful for mixing. I find those keyboard shortcuts super useful. I use them all the time. And then finally, these two VSTs aren't essential by any means, but I feel like for my setup and how I like to do things, they're really helpful. So I use them in combination. SonarWorks is a VST which maps your headphones to an EQ, and it will basically it'll make corrections to the EQ of your headphones and make it a flat sound. So the idea of this is like, whatever headphones you use, it'll color the audio in a certain way, which can then mess up your mixing decisions, right? So for example, I've got Bayer dynamic headphones, which are awesome. Really punchy highs, really powerful high frequencies, and also pretty good sub bass as well. And I can't actually see it on this graph. I don't know how this graph's working, but the high frequencies on these headphones is so powerful. Like this, you can really hear the difference this VST makes, right? So if I play it, so you can hear that's almost like a low pass filter being put on. That is effectively to represent a flat audio signal, like what you'd hear in a club or, you know, the average set of speakers. Again, don't ask me why it doesn't come up on this graph here. Don't know why it's not doing anything. I feel like it's also probably taking a bit of bass out as well. But yeah, so this is a helpful one for headphones. So it has the key, or most of the key headphones out on the market in here already programmed. And even if your headphones aren't on the list, I believe there's a way to get them added if you speak to the team. This really good VST to use in combination with this second one here, which is called Can Opener by GHZ, and this is effectively replicating what it sounds like. It's effectively replicating what your track would sound like on a club. So flat, they call it a flat sound, with no crossfeed, which again, don't ask me on the technicals. I'm not an audio engineer, but the idea is here, like what would your song sound like in a treated room with, you know, flat mixing speakers in the right place, effectively giving you a completely transparent audio signal to mix with, right? Or as I'd like to say, what you know, if I'm mixing without these two, right, you're mixing to that sort of sound. That's very different to this sound. You're going to make completely different decisions. You're going to, the high end's probably going to be too low if I'm using just these speakers in Ableton. If you add these in, then it actually shows you actually your highs aren't that loud, so you probably need to increase them as an example. So yeah, I like to use these two a lot when I'm mixing. Not essential, I would say. If you're just starting out, you can just reference a track. You don't even need the reference VST to reference as well. You can just load your songs into your projects and just compare your song against them. But for those of you more advanced, yeah, I'd recommend checking these two out, especially if you're doing, well, particularly if you're doing lots of mixing, mastering on headphones. Very helpful. Right, guys, look, that's my template. That's what I use to start all my tracks. And yeah, keen to hear your thoughts. Please have a play with it, and yeah, look forward to seeing your own templates and improving this one as well. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Speak soon.